No matter what I did, I could not please him. The fear was so overwhelming, I nearly vomited every time I heard his voice, but he dropped me in the water if he noticed, so I had to put my face under water and throw up as quietly as I could. Dio's punishments and assaults continued. I wasn't allowed to rest safely in the box. I became dehydrated and then sunsick. I was running a fever, unable to think, unable to understand what was happening to me. I didn't even know who I was. Dio had denied me everything. When the sun sank below the horizon, Dio opened the lid of the box and appeared before me. He'd been sipping my blood since sunrise, and his burns had almost completely healed. His skin and hair were glossy, and against the clouds of dusk he appeared to be a very handsome man indeed. My eyes did not see Dio Brando, but someone who owned me completely. I was his toy to do with as he pleased. There was a part of me oddly proud that my owner was so beautiful. His strange power held me just above the surface of the water. Dio looked down at me and smiled.
"You're wet, filthy, ugly, and good for nothing but your blood. While I allow you to live, give me all the blood you have. You don't have my permission to die."
Beneath that crimson sky, I at last saw Dio for who he was. My mind finally realized the man standing there was Dio Brando. And I remembered. I was Erina Joestar. My maiden name was Erina Pendleton. And I realized one other thing. During the day, when Dio had been placing me under his control, I had wondered if he desired me as a woman. But of course he didn't. He was Dio Brando. Even when he'd been rough with me to tear Jonathan and me apart, he never actually cared about me. He'd simply been trying to isolate Jonathan. I'd simply been a tool, a pawn to make that happen. Even though he had not broken my spirit because he wanted me. He didn't care about me. Not 10 years ago and not now. Sitting on the lid, Dio used his mysterious power to bring me closer to him and turned me upside down, dangling in the air.
"Give your new husband a kiss," he sneered, "of your own free will. Make it a good one, and I might give you water and food."
No sooner had the words left his mouth than my hand shot out and slapped him across the face. I scarcely even knew that I was smiling. "I can't do that. There's no muddy water to wash my lips with." I'll refrain from explaining what I meant by that, but resisting him like this, as strung out as I was, seemed to catch Dio off guard. He looked surprised, and didn't react immediately. It was but a moment, but I had time to think. He was the same man he'd been 10 years before. His core hadn't changed. He was doing the same thing, repeating what had happened 10 years ago. He was dominating me to isolate Jonathan, to make him feel powerless. He wanted Jonathan to see what he was doing to me, so Jonathan must be close enough to see me. Dio Brando had been a vampire without a body. He'd stolen Jonathan Joestar's body. So what had happened to his head? Had he left it on the ship? With his obsessive nature? Of course not. He would have taken it with him, and then humiliated his wife in front of it. That was the sort of monster he was, and he had the power to keep Jonathan alive, even as a severed head. Dio Brando was a vampire, and he turned the ship's passengers into living corpses. He must have done the same thing to Jonathan. He turned him into one of those horrible monsters from the ship. This thought made me shake with sadness and fear, but it also gave me strength. I took my eyes off Dio and looked around me, trying not to betray my intent. There are any number of ship fragments floating near us. The waves have not drawn them away. This seemed odd. Odd enough. Was Dio's strange power keeping them here? He wasn't just keeping them in case he needed a fire. If he wanted that, he could have moved the number of them into the box, or used his power to pile them up on top of the lid, and let them dry. I'd watched him lighting the wet wood, and it took a considerable amount of time. So he wasn't keeping them floating here for use as firewood, but to hide something underneath. Just as Dio had hidden beneath the box, I looked again, searching for something large enough to hide Jonathan's head. But before I could find it, Dio reached his hand out and wrapped it round my throat.
"Your tongue is sharp, Erina Joestar. So be it. The night has just begun. I can take my time and let you know just how dull you are, and just how pathetic your violent outburst was."
I stared at him in silence, thinking. A few moments ago I'd been so terrified of him, but not any more, not now Jonathan was at my side. Jonathan was here with me. That thought alone made me live again. It didn't matter if he was a monster or the living dead. Jonathan was Jonathan, my husband. I wouldn't allow myself to grovel before another man with him watching. I knew Dio would continue to torment me. Even if Jonathan had become a monster, if any trace of humanity remained within him, he wouldn't want to see me treated like this. But he'd no way of escaping, unless somebody allowed him to die. As his wife, that was my duty. This was an awful thought, but I felt certain Jonathan would not be able to bear turning into one of those ugly monsters I'd seen on the ship. So my first order of business became escaping from the grip of whatever power kept me suspended in the air. That was easy enough, as long as I could bear the pain. When Dio had this power to throw me into the ocean, it often left me to my own devices, especially if it was sure I was too exhausted to swim. My spirit might have returned, but the fear was still very strong. It was all I could do not to tremble or throw up. But I managed to look calm long enough to say, "Hold your tongue. You are no longer human, and have no right to speak that way to me." Dio's grin vanished. "Not that you had any right to speak to me when you were human. You spoke and lived and behaved like a gentleman on the surface, but you never were one. You have an inferiority complex about your impoverished origins, and that prevents you from improving yourself as a human. Let me tell you, Dio Brando, your poverty did not make you a villain. Your relationship with your parents did not make you what you are. Lack of education or wealth had no bearing. You were doomed by your own inability to look beyond the surface of anything, by your shallow mind, and by your overwhelming self-importance." As I spoke these words, I realized I wasn't just trying to make him mad. I meant every word, and genuinely believed I was speaking the truth. And Dio's reaction made it clear I'd touched a nerve. For several moments, he remained shaken. Then he yelled, "Shut up, you bitch!" and used his mysterious power to shove me under the water. When I'd almost drowned, it yanked me out. He yelled at me again, and shoved me back under so hard I almost passed out. But I couldn't afford to lose consciousness here. I desperately shook off the blackness, opened my eyes underwater, and looked for Jonathan. But there were so many bubbles around my body I could barely see. As soon as the bubbles began to thin, I was yanked out of the water. Dio's fury, or rather his consternation, was tremendous, and I was in and out of the water, swallowing it and coughing it up so fast the water coming in and the water coming up met in the back of my throat and formed a whirlpool. I had no choice but to endure it, though it was hardly endurable. But I had to keep myself conscious and alive. I nearly suffocated on the seawater and vomit, but just before I did, Dio's power let go. I was flung a good 10 meters away, and hit the water with a thunderous splash, and sank into the churn of the ocean. As I cleared my throat, I caught a glimpse of something under the debris near the box. My husband's head, Jorge Joestar's head, bobbing up and down. It was far away, and I couldn't make out what kind of monster he'd become, but peering through the murky waters, I knew I had to do my duty as his wife and kill my husband. I knew this was my one and only chance to act. I had to do it while I was far away from Dio and the box, before he noticed what I was up to. My body and mind couldn't take much more torture. I wouldn't physically be able to act much longer. Further violence would almost certainly lead me to lose myself again, become Dio's toy, and allow myself to suffer all manner of indignities with Jonathan watching. I wanted to avoid that at all costs. So I surfaced, coughed violently, emptying both stomach and lungs, and then pretended to faint, allowing myself to sink beneath the water. I knew Dio wouldn't pull me out immediately, and I guessed he was so angry that he would probably leave me to drown until the last possible moment. Once I was a few meters below the surface, I began to swim as fast as I could. I was never the best swimmer, and my dress was heavy and made it hard to move at all, but I thrashed my arms and legs with all my might, desperate to reach Jonathan and kill him. At last I reached Jonathan, and my resolve proved to be for naught. Floating beneath the remains of the ship, in water still tinged orange from the sunlight, was the head of my beautiful, beloved Jorge Joestar. Not a monster, but looking for all the world like he was still alive. No matter what he'd become, after a day in the water, I expected the head's flesh to have decayed, his skin nibbled away by fish. So this miraculous sight made me gasp. I was transfixed. I had been so focused on laying my monstrous husband to rest, and he not only wasn't a monster, he didn't even look dead. Hesitantly, I reached out my hand and touched Jonathan's head. The living corpses on the ship had growled furiously, attacking anything living indiscriminately, but Jonathan's eyes remained slightly open, not looking at me, not trying to bite me, not moving at all. I took him in my arms and held him close, feeling the softness of his hair against my cheek. My husband was so different from what I had expected that I lingered too long, and Dio's mysterious power found me. It grabbed me by the collar and yanked me out of the water.
You knew Jonathan was down there? Dio roared. You fool! Do you want your husband to eat you?
This, and the panic in his voice, surprised me, but Jonathan's head was cradled in my arms, smiling gently, saying nothing. He didn't seem like he would ever attack me. Perhaps even more surprising was that Dio tried to yank Jonathan away from me, as if trying to rescue me from him.
No!
He yelled, and that invisible hand of his tried to snatch Jonathan from my arms. We struggled for control of him for a moment, but he soon stopped trying. The hand let go, I got my arms back tightly around the head, and then I turned around to find Dio staring at Jonathan.
What's going on?
He whispered. Clearly, Dio found Jonathan's condition as surprising as I did. I could never have killed Jonathan with him still looking this beautiful, but from Dio's reaction, it seemed I might not have to. The relief was so great I nearly fainted. But if I fainted, there was no telling what Dio might do to Jonathan, so I persevered. Dio set us down on the lid of the box, where he and Lisa stood.
Jonathan, how long will you pursue me? How long will our fates remain entwined?
He muttered, glaring at Jonathan's head. I knew the danger wasn't yet over. Indeed, Jonathan's arrival had sent Dio into a fit.
I won't allow it. He'll get in my way again. I can leave no part of him. Erina Joestar, he's already dead.
I knew I had to protect my husband's head until this passed. I grabbed a piece of driftwood and turned to face Dio. I won't let you touch Jonathan, I cried. I put the sharp end to my throat and stabbed it into the side of my neck, piercing my jugular. As a nurse, I knew this wound was fatal. I had dug deeply to ensure it would be. I drew the jagged piece of wood all the way around, across my windpipe, and opened the other vein. I needed to release a great quantity of blood at once. Blood filled my vision, spraying out in arcs. I could feel it coating my shoulders, warm and wet. Good, I thought. The wound had to be deep enough to kill me instantly. Dio screamed.
What are you doing, you stupid bitch?
I'm pretty sure I laughed out loud. He was so predictable. I knew it. I knew Dio couldn't kill me. The first sign was when he tried to separate me and Jonathan. He believed Jonathan was a monster and tried to rescue me. Given Dio's obsession with Jonathan, his unnatural fixation on causing him grief, then letting Jonathan eat me seemed like something he would welcome, or at least not stop immediately. But in that instant, he blurted out his true feelings. What with the blood gushing out of my neck, I swiftly lost consciousness, but eventually I woke up again. Dio had given me blood and used his power to heal the wound on my neck. I was woken by the sound of Lisa crying and found Dio collapsed next to me. He'd injected me with most of the blood he'd drunk, and while he remained conscious, he was as weak as he'd been when he first emerged from the box. Perhaps even worse. This time he didn't even have the strength to take Lisa hostage. He'd come close to sacrificing himself to save me, and he looked relieved to see me awake again. I first checked the condition of my wound. As far as I could tell, the gash on my throat had been sewn together, the work as fine as any surgeon. Despite myself, I was impressed. Where did you learn to do this? I asked. Slumped against the corner of the box, Dio glanced at me and rasped.
In a book. I liked reading. I read all kinds of things, taught myself anything that might be useful.
For the first time, I felt I understood just how alone Dio had always been. Outwardly, Dio had been surrounded by friends, the life of the party. He never seemed like someone who would have time to read. But now I could imagine him slipping away early. His friendships were shallow, for appearances only. Alone he had nothing to do but read. Nothing Dio's ambition granted him was real. He had no one he could share his real feelings with, nothing he'd genuinely accomplished with his own 2 hands. His life was hollow. This, I thought, was why he'd been so fixated on Jonathan. Jonathan was stuffed full where Dio was empty. He'd grown up to be a man who made genuine friends he could honestly share his emotions with, a man who threw himself body and soul into everything he did. Growing up in the same house with that, how could Dio not compare himself to Jonathan? The frustration this comparison caused him was perhaps the one genuine emotion he ever felt, and because he was unused to such emotion, he grew confused and was driven to kill Jonathan and steal his body. If he wanted to be like Jonathan, he should have just told people how he felt and made himself a true friend. The life he'd led before joining the Joestars had made Dio Brando who he was, and true friendship was almost certainly an impossibility for him. But Jonathan Joestar was not the sort of man to push someone away just because they'd committed a crime. If he'd allowed his feelings to show, some solution would have been found. Thinking about it, it occurred to me Dio had been expressing those emotions as clearly as he knew how. Hurting Jonathan, trying to kill him, these were a backhanded way of expressing his admiration. Had he felt that for anyone but Jonathan, he would never have admitted it. I'd seen the result of their conflict myself, and was seeing it now, here on this little box. One had become a severed head, and I couldn't even tell if he was alive or dead. The other had become a vampire, and stolen his rival's body, but had given his blood to save that rival's wife, placing himself at the brink of death as well. I hugged Jonathan's head to me, looked over at Dio, and found myself shedding tears for both of them. I was overcome with sadness, grief, and pain. I made no attempt to wipe the tears away, letting them roll down my cheeks. His voice hoarse, Dio asked,
Are you going to kill me?
I will not, I said.
Do you cry because you pity me?
He asked. You may have saved my life, but I can never pity you. I just wondered why you and Jonathan had to end up like this, and I couldn't stop myself.
It was fated,
Dio said. Does it have something to do with the way to heaven? I asked. He made a face.
You heard that. Damn it. If I could kill you, I would.
Is not killing me a condition for getting to heaven? He didn't answer. Instead, he said,
Do you know what blood is?
When I didn't answer, Dio said,
Blood is power, Erina Joestar. Make blood to live. This is good for me. And what is good for me is good for you.
Dio knew. He knew the wicked thought that had entered my head when I held Jonathan in my arms. Her long story drawing to a close, Mum looked at Lisa. I could have killed Dio Brando there and then, but I didn't. When the night ended, I put Dio in the bottom compartment, and when a ship rescued us, I had them weigh the box down and sink it. This is my sin. I couldn't kill Dio, even though I would have killed Jonathan if he'd been a monster. You see, I had hope.
Hope? What part of this story led to hope?
Lisa's face was grim. Not hope that Dio would regret his actions and become a better person. That man is incapable of such a thing.
Then what kind of hope? Mum turned to look at my father's head.
But as long as Dio is alive, then Jonathan's body is too.
I felt a bolt of electricity run down my spine.
Her eyes locked on my father. Mum said, Jonathan is not dead, and I didn't want to lose the chance to get his body back. I believed that day would come, and I'd been waiting here, in the hope that it would. This was why Mum had started living in the Canary Islands, never returning home to England. She wanted to remain with Father's head, near the sea where his body slumbered. But this also meant Dio Brando was still alive, and the only way anyone could ever get a chance to get Father's body back was if they faced him directly. Even if he was locked in a box on the brink of death, he was a vampire, and from what Mum told us, Even without moving his body, he had some strange power that allowed him to do all manner of horrible things to her. He seemed incredibly dangerous. Mum Erina, Lisa said, this mysterious power Dio had, it seems to have shown up when he stole George's father's body. That's not a power vampires have, and he didn't do anything like that when he was fighting George's father. Then you're most likely correct. That first night, when Dio was outside the box, he seemed confused. That might have something to do with it. Powers like that. Some people are born with them, and others get them after something dramatic happens, or an injury or the like. The Hamon masters call these spirit Hamon, or stands. A strange name, but people with these power can see the power standing next to them, like a ghost. So I don't think Dio was confused that night. You make it sound like he tried talking to it, and tried fighting with it. In other words, he saw this ghost-like thing and didn't know what it was. Stands often look like people. Mum was hardly in a position to know for sure. Her story done, the three of us went upstairs. Penelope looked terrified and threw her arms around me, refusing to let go. So many people died! George, I'm scared! This island is a scary place! Huh? I was scared too, and the way Lisa was looking at us was scarier. But what was scariest was a fire that had broken out in the one church on La Palma, in which 70 people perished. Why they were in the church in the middle of the night, nobody knew. But the doctor who treated my wounds had been there, and Lisa said everyone who died there had seen the man with black wings, the man who looked like a moth. And the walls of the burned-down church were covered in drawings of a man with giant wings who looked just like their descriptions. When the sun rose, we went to the church. So this is the Mothman, Lisa said. I shuddered. Don't give it a scary name. I didn't make it up. Still, I couldn't stop shaking. Every wall of the burned-out church was covered in pictures of the Mothman. Countless pictures. Before the fire had started, everyone there must have been frantically covering the walls in drawings. The very thought sent a chill down my spine. These are drawn in the ash from the fire. They were using their own fingers as charcoal sticks. These people had been turned into zombies, and drew these pictures before the fire killed them again. Even though Penelope was still clinging to me, I'm pretty sure I let a drop of pee loose. Just one, I swear. It may well be this happened because we're here, Mum said. George, let us return to England. You can come too, Penelope. Huh? Seriously? Really? I can come too, Erina? Penelope cried. I'd love to. George, say I can come. Of course. I was pleased as punch. I could finally leave this awful island. But are you sure? About leaving Father's body? I'm sure when the time comes, we'll be brought together. Whether I'm living close by or far away. That's the power we have. Blood is power. End of chapter 5.